This is really an amazing time to be here to do a lobby day. I mean, granted, the massive change of January 20th was not primarily in Congress, but that massive change was massive, and it's having a spillover effect to Congress, without any question. The hope that emerged. How many of you, I know most of you are not from DC, but how many of you were on the Mall on Inauguration Day? Yeah, a bunch of you were. Wasn't it amazing? I mean, that sense of hope and optimism, even in the face of the horrors going on around the world, which didn't stop overnight on January 20th, but that sense that things could change and had changed is still so important. And you're there just a few days, what it's been 10 days since the inauguration. I mean, it's still fresh, it's still real. So this is an incredibly great time to be going onto the Hill. It's true that the crisis in Gaza challenged that sense of optimism. The fact that Obama didn't say anything during that period, I mean, that's all true. But it's also true that this happened at a moment that the discourse itself has changed massively in this country, not just around the Obama campaign, although that's a part of it, and reflected it. But, you know, we see President Jimmy Carter's books, particularly his last book, Peace, Not Apartheid. We see the U.S. campaign to end Israeli occupation going out on a 3-week tour focusing on Israeli apartheid, featuring a Palestinian lawyer and the head of the South African Council of Churches. We couldn't have done that 2 years ago. And that doesn't mean they didn't get any hostile questions or whatever. Of course they did. But the discourse is out there. It's now something to be debated, not something to be dismissed. The rise of the Jewish anti-occupation organizations all over the country, they're popping up like mushrooms. And let me just say that I think there's a nuance here. On the one hand, it's great that those organizations are popping up. It challenges the domination of the Jewish community by pro-Zionist forces that have always claimed to speak in the name of all Jews. So challenging that is huge. But I caution you that there is a downside. The downside is every time we promote the organizations of Jews Against the Occupation, Jewish Voice for Peace, Jews for Peace in Palestine and Israel, the whole range of them, we're also giving credence to the idea that somehow Jews have more of a right to criticize Israeli policy than everybody else. And I say that as a Jew. I don't think we do. I think that those of us who live in this country and pay taxes in this country, and those of us who are citizens who vote in this country, we have just as much right to criticize what's done with our tax money in our name, without our consent, as anyone who is challenging the Jewish organizations. So it's a good thing, it's a tactical advantage, but there's a strategic cost that's in there that we have to just keep in mind. But keep in mind, too, the impact of all of this. In the height of the Israeli attack on Gaza, what we saw was the Rasmussen poll saying that essentially the country is divided 50-50. The actual numbers were 44% said they support the Israeli side, 41% say they support the Palestinian side. That's huge. That's within the margin of error. It means it's even. When did that ever happen? When Israel is claiming self-defense as the basis for an attack, when did it ever happen that the split was 50-50? That's huge, and it's because of the work all of you have done, it's because of the work of interfaith peace builders, it's because of the work of all of the 260 organizations in the U.S. campaign, it's because of all our work. That's what makes this all possible. So this is a moment for real possibilities. It's true, Obama is saying some terrible things. He's saying things that came out of the mouth of George Bush. George Mitchell has said some pretty awful things in the last couple of days. But what they've done has been, I would argue, more important than what they've said. So the day that President Obama goes to the State Department and announces all this stuff about his policy, he says some pretty rotten stuff. We won't talk to Hamas. Hamas can't be talked to until they abide by the 3 requirements of the so-called quartet, et cetera, et cetera. That's all kind of a drag. But what does he do? He doesn't appoint Dennis Ross or Martin Indyk or Richard Haas or any of the others, he still might appoint Dennis Ross to be the envoy for Iran. Let's be careful. It's not about booing. It's about showing why that's not in American national interest. But he did appoint George Mitchell, who comes from an entirely different place on these issues, who wrote as recently as a year and a half ago that the reason that the Good Friday Accord worked in Ireland was, number one, because it recognized that everybody had to be at the table, that you couldn't exclude some players because you thought they were terrorists. Well, what does that say about the willingness to speak to Hamas? It may be quiet, it may be under the radar, we may not hear about it for a while, but George Mitchell gets that. Then he said, you can and must demand that anybody participating in the negotiations declare a ceasefire and stop using military force. That's real and necessary, and we agree with that. But he said, you can't expect them to give up their arms prematurely. We have to recognize that too. And finally, he said the most important thing, you can't ask people to give up their dreams. You can ask people to act on their dreams only by political means and not by weapons. That's legitimate. But you can't ask people to give up their dreams. So if you have somebody who believes they want a Palestinian state from the sea to the river, they don't have to give that up. They don't have to give up that dream. Any more than we ask Israeli extremists who believe of a so-called return to a so-called Jewish state in all of that territory. We don't ask them to give up their dreams. They just have to give up imposing that dream at the point of the gun. George Mitchell gets that. So the action of appointing George Mitchell is far more important than the rhetorical restatement of the Bush-era language. So let's hold on to that. Let's look at what the new options are, the new possibilities are. Now, one thing that I think is very important that has been said by Obama and others in the Obama administration, even though it may not be said yet by members of Congress, is that what's going on in the Israel-Palestine conflict does not represent solely an adjunct